That's what an enzyme does, and the body is filled with hundreds of them, digestive enzymes and all kinds that keep the body going. There's one enzyme out of thousands called cytochrome C, on which quite a lot of research has been done. This enzyme facilitates the capacity of cells to use oxygen to burn the fuel that is dropped by through the bloodstream and take the energy out so that the cell can go on working. So it's a very important enzyme. And we know that that protein, cytochrome C, that enzyme, depends upon 312 nucleic acids which code 104 amino acids in a specific sequence. And that makes up one molecule. And then when you make the next molecule, you have 104 more. And then they hook together and finally they build up the liver or whatever it is. In this case, it's this enzyme. There is one amino acid difference in the chain of 104 between a rhesus monkey and man on that enzyme. In other words, you take cytochrome C enzyme from a monkey and the one from a man, and you compare them under the microscope. There's one amino acid's difference out of the chain of 104. Between man and a horse, there are 12. Between a chicken and man, 14. Between a tuna fish and man, 22. And between yeast and us, 43. So, we are more like yeast than we are unlike it. And the interesting thing is, it takes around 10 million years to establish a single change in an amino acid sequence. Well, life emerged, and it seemed to be organized around two basic principles. That when these nucleic acids are coding for the sequence of amino acid chains to make up proteins out of which we're all made, sometimes there was a deviation from the previous pattern. And this deviation was primarily caused by solar radiation. In the early days, we did not have a thick atmosphere. So the sun's rays came banging down, and they were powerful enough to keep knocking an electron out here, an electron out there, and changing things. So you had massive genetic mutations in those early billions of years, or millions of years. And so there was a proliferation of life forms, both plant and animal. Now, every plant, every living creature only survives by virtue of its being able to find a niche in the environment that serves its needs. And if it can't find that niche, or it doesn't have what it takes to survive in whatever niche it's in, then it goes extinct, or it's killed early. And if it dies early, it's not around to reproduce very much, so it doesn't leave very many offsprings, and eventually it goes extinct. Now, let me just give you an example of how that principle of natural selection coupled with mutation has worked to produce us, or to produce some form. You know, the horse at one time was about this high and had 5 fingers. The modern horse today stands about so high and has hoofs. Or do you say hooves? Now, if you look at the horse's hoof under an X-ray, you'll see the bones coming down like 5 fingers into the hoof. Comes down sort of like that, and if you look at the X-ray, you see the bones coming down, and you see 4 fingers coming down into the hoof, and the thumb kind of got short and was bent under and became the hock. Now, what happened? When the climate changed, and trees began to disappear, and the glaciers were moving animals down. The soft tissued hand wasn't very good for survival, running around on rocks. So somewhere along the line, a horse was born. It had stubbier fingers and thicker skin. And that horse lasted longer and reproduced one more season. And he passed on that characteristic genetically. So a certain number of his offspring had thinner hands, some had thicker hands. The thicker ones lasted longer, reproduced more, and their offspring got thicker and thicker, and pretty soon the skin got so thick that it became a hoof. Well, the fingernails really all came together. That's what the hoof is. It's a big, ugly fingernail, I guess you'd say. Not so big and thick you could put a shoe on it, right? And the thumb just got shorter and shorter because it was in the way, and it just kind of turned under. See? And lo and behold, we got the horse, who could survive, you see, because he can gallop around on all those rocks with these hoofs. Well, natural selection plays everywhere enormous force on what's called evolutionary pressure on every organism. Man appeared on the scene somewhere between 1 million and 2 million years ago. The biggest era of evolutionary stretch of geological time, it's called the Precambrian era, and it's over 4 billion. That's the biggest chunk. We are relative newcomers. Now, several 100 million years before man was the golden age of the reptiles. For some reason, the earth got very warm. The ice all melted. The oceans filled up. And the pressure of the ice on the ground enabled the ground to come up, and you got mountains and hills, and the continents arose. And in the course of that, incidentally, there were a lot of trapped fish who had emerged millions of years ago. And you know, if you have a shallow pool, there's not enough oxygen in the water. Some of these fish took to getting some of the oxygen by gulping at the surface. They could get some oxygen from the surface of the water and some through the gills. When the pond dried up, fish with stubby fins who were practicing more and more gulping air from the surface could actually crawl out on the land for a while and still survive. They still had gills, but they were taking more and more oxygen through the mouth until finally we had our first amphibians. And later, these gill slits moved up evolutionary and became our ears. In fact, if you've ever seen a human embryo in the very early stages, they have gill slits. They have a tail. And you cannot tell a fish embryo from a chick embryo, from a cow embryo, horse embryo, pig embryo, and human embryo at that stage. Because in the course of the gestation period, they go through the whole period of evolutionary history before. In the case of a human being, in the course of 9 months. And of course, they're in this little amniotic sac in the mother's womb, which holds a 9% salt solution, which is about the degree of salt solution of the ocean, out of which all life emerged. We just carry a little bit of the ocean, I don't know if it's Pacific or Atlantic, in the sac. And in the course of 9 months, the child transgresses 4.5 billion years of evolution in order to produce the fully formed human being. During that age of the reptiles, the ones that emerged dominant were a class of reptiles called dinosaurs. There was so much water around that those dinosaurs could be buoyed up by the swamps they were in. And but as the swamps dried up, you see, what was there to hold up all that bulk? These dinosaurs had feet this big around. Some of them were upwards of 100 feet long. and they weighed many, many tons. And in fact, these dinosaurs, in spite of their enormous size, had a brain the size of a walnut. Now, almost all of that brain was given over to keeping track of where parts of the dinosaur were. I mean, the psychomotor area in that walnut was almost the entire walnut. In fact, the dinosaur got so long that the amount of time it took to get the message from the walnut brain in the head down to the tail saying, "Get out of the way, here comes a dinosaur-eating dinosaur." You know, the big brontosaurus, you know, the gentle one with the tiny head, you know, that looks like that. You know, that one was vegetarian. But the Tyrannosaurus rex, which is the one with the tiny forefeet and the big hind legs and the big tail and teeth, ate this one. And so, you know, if he could see the Tyrannosaurus rex coming over here, he needed to get a message down here to get out of the way. And if it didn't, then he'd become dinosaur burgers. So what evolution did was it began to make a little auxiliary brain back here, also about the size of a walnut. And so they just had a sort of secondary headquarters hindquarters, I guess, back there to sort of... And there was frequent communication between the two, obviously, because if they tried to run in opposite directions, you'd have trouble. But eventually, the dinosaur became extinct, and I've often musingly thought to myself that there's a lesson in extinction here. That if you begin doing thinking with the wrong part of the anatomy, you're apt to become extinct. And seeing some of our social and governmental policies now, you have to wonder where our politicians are doing their thinking at. Presumably their brains are bigger than walnuts, so there's got to be some other answer. These rascals were around for 125 million years. They were durable. But you know what? When the Ice Age came and the puddles dried up, they had so specifically adapted to their environment that they couldn't survive, and they could not generate enough mutations to create new forms. They just came to an end. They have no descendants. For them it was total kaputness. It's very interesting. At the same time, a new kind of creature emerged that was warm-blooded. See, these creatures, when they woke up in the morning, were cold, and they had moved very slow. They couldn't move very fast till they warmed up, because they're the same temperature as whatever they're in. But a new class of animal that had a mutation that enabled them to be warm-blooded came on the scene. Little rodent-like creatures, the mammals. And after the reptiles went and the dinosaurs went, the mammals rose supreme. These mammals had a walnut-sized brain too, but the relationship between a walnut brain-sized rat and a walnut brain-sized dinosaur is quite different, because the rat's body is only tiny, and you only need a little tiny piece of the brain to keep track of all parts of the body of the rat, so you can use other parts to do other things. Well, it's very interesting. Cut a long story short. When that ice age descended about 1 million years ago or so, by this time, creatures that looked very much like man, a little more hairy perhaps, had spread almost all over the planet. But when that ice age came, there was a great pressure to deal with that, creating, otherwise the survival would have been impossible, creating means of survival. They had to think up the idea of killing a bear and taking the skin and putting it around you. They had to think up the idea of building a shelter. They had to think up an idea of how they're going to store food. And in that space of that ice age, the size of the human brain increased more rapidly than any other organ in the entire history of evolution. What emerged was matter so complexly organized it could store history, it could remember. And one of the things that emerged at that time, not only could it remember, but it began to be able to create sounds which stood for other things. Communication and speech became a possibility, and this would make knowledge and culture cumulative and caused man, humanity, to emerge at the apex of evolutionary forces, at least on this planet, without a shadow of a doubt. Man is the supreme adapter to any environment and the supreme modifier of every environment. That rapid growth of the brain really is one of the most incredible stories, because originally the part of the brain that interprets smell was very big. And when creatures took to the trees, there's not much smell up there. And what became more and more important was vision. And you jump around the tree, you can't sniff out where the limb is. You have to see it if you're going to be jumping around. Eyes and hand coordination became very important, and eventually the swinging around with the arms enabled the shoulder blades to go back until eventually man became erect. You had the hands free, and now with hand-eye coordination you could become a tool maker. Once you had tools, you had an extension of the capability of the human body. And once you had language, you could explain it to other people, you could remember it, you could transmit it from generation to generation. You wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel each generation. Culture became possible, and you had a new creature. Now, in recorded history,
Mr. DeCarly, please call the office.
In recorded history, which has lasted about 6,000 years, enormous advances have been made. Since the time of Plato, 2,500 years ago, it's just incredible what has happened. And since the middle of the 19th century, there has been an explosion of knowledge. And in the last 50 years, it has been so mind-boggling that education is left flattened and sagging under the advance of new knowledge. And the way we're trying to do it now in education, I think you can see is not going to work. In education alone, there are 740 periodicals each month. Now, how are you going to read them? You hardly have time to prepare your lessons for your children. This month's issue of Scientific American is entirely an update on the story of evolution. How many of you will have time to read that? And even if you could, you would not have had the time to prepare yourself in all the sciences that would enable you to understand it. In the next 8 years, the Library of Congress will double in size. And then it will take only 6 years for it to double in size. What are we going to do with our kids? We're going to still teach them about the Battle of Hastings? That's why, as we head towards the year 2000, we're going to have an educational system that focuses on the achievement of learning competence as the key factor in the actualization of human potential. And that's where the basic locus of education in the future will have to be, in my opinion. Because almost all the information we'll ask children to memorize will be obsolete or out of date. I've come to look at educational diplomas and degrees really as certificates of obsolescence. It says the bearer of this certificate is hereby out of date by virtue of the fact that the information he learned is no longer useful. But supposing you get a certificate that says the bearer of this certificate has become a master learner, and he can learn anything quickly. That'd be a certificate worth having, because it means you could adapt. The U.S. Department of Labor says that people are going to have to change jobs. Those kids who are born now, by the time they're adults, will have to change their jobs as many as 12 times in their adult life, and they may be major job changes. I mean, it won't go from spading a garden to raking the leaves. It's going to be big jumps. And only those who can learn something new are going to be the best survivors, obviously. Now, that's the evolutionary context now to understand something about the nature of human beings. Somebody says it would be helpful to stand up and wiggle a bit. Let me just make this point and then I'll have you stand up. I don't know if the heat is on or the air is off or I'm having hot flashes, one of the two. Maybe a combination of all three. I want you to keep that story of evolution just in your mind, because you go back a very long way. Obviously, the actual elements that make you up, the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen, and the nitrogen, was here 4.5 billion years ago. So I know you thought you were under 30 or under 40, but actually you're 4.5 billion years old. And as you eat and you breathe, you replace the parts, and that sort of keeps you going. Eventually, the decaying wears you out and takes over, and then you die. And then you completely disintegrate, but those chemicals, you go back into the ground, suddenly you become the grass, some cow eats you, milk is made, and some baby drinks the milk, and now you are part of the baby's bones. So we really are interconnected. All of us were probably parts of dinosaurs at one time.